Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Straw Greenhorn. And he spake a parable unto them. The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he said within himself, What shall I do? For I have nowhere to bestow all my fruits. Then saith he, This is what I shall do. I shall pull down my barns and build greater barns. And there shall I bestow all my fruits and goods. And I shall say unto my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy very soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall all these things be wherein thou hast provided? So here we have a parable of the rich man and his ground that brought forth. Now, we just saw this brother, while Jesus was teaching, lift up his voice and ask a question. Speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. God said, Man, what have I to do with thee? Who made me a judge or a divider among you? And then he warn them about covetousness, how a man's life consisted not in the things wherein he possesses. So now he's using this story to tie into that fact. And not so much so the other things that he was saying before about, confessing or denying him before men, blaspheming the Holy Ghost, the very hairs of your head being numbered, are you not worth more than many sparrows? No, this parable is in, direct relation to this man who stood up. So apparently his brother had the inheritance, and for whatever reason, he was not sharing it with him. I've spoken in the last video how he might have been left out of the will, for whatever for a legitimate reason. Or the brother, he could have just been selfish and not wanting to share it. So, Jesus not getting into this family mix, he is looking at possessions and how people, value these things. So, he goes into this parable, right? So now we understand that, the gist of this is to show, the typical pathway a person will take, when it comes to material things. We know that the Bible says that money answereth all things, right? And the rich have many friends, but the poor man is despised, right? So it's easy to see how a human being can get on the track of thinking, well, the more I have, the better it will be for me. But Jesus, he's showing the principle that he's showing here is how these things, they can come as a distraction. It can take you off course, actually. You being rich and being so happy as this man was, it took him off course. And look what happened. He lost his life. He didn't even get to enjoy any of it. So, this lets us know that there's an underlying state, within us that should be running at all times. How we're not moved by material things. Our principles are not molded by material things. The person who we, are, that's not influenced by material things. The judgments that we make, the values that we hold, right? The position and the stance that we take in life, things that we esteem, the things that we fight for and defend and protect, the things that we uphold. These things, they are not, to be molded or influenced by material things. Because, the second that you do that, then, what did he say unto them? Are you not become judges of evil things? You are judges of evil things. When he gave that parable of the rich man that came in and you gave him such an honorable seat, but you put the poor man under your footstool, right? So in this parable, we see, as he usually uses, a farming, kind of thing. We know that in those days, they were farmers and shepherds, right? They either grew crops or they raised animals. Cain and Abel, the first two brothers. Cain, he was farmer, but Abel, he raised the animals, right? So now we see a return being given by this man's ground. So he put the work in, right? If you want to take this literally or figuratively, did he literally plant these crops and then the harvest brought in this fruit? Or, did he work hard for something and then it paid off, right? You can look at it both ways, I think. But, the symbolism is meant to capture the underlying principle. So, he's speaking this parable unto them. So, parable, as I always say, it's meant to disarm. It's meant to present things in an objective way so that even you can look at it and judge right. The benefit of this and the use. The purpose really is how people, when things are about them, they can become prejudiced. If you remember the story of David and Bathsheba, when David sinned and lay with her, and then he had the husband killed, Uriah in Bath. The prophet went unto David and he spoke by a parable. He said a certain, rich man had, a lot of animals. He had a great flock, but then, one of his friends came unto him and he took this poor man's one sheep who he loved so much. The sheep did eat at his table, to sleep in his bed, things like that. How he, treat this sheep like family. And yet he took this man's one sheep and offered it to his friends, to eat. And David, he was wroth. He said, who is this man? He shall surely die. Then the prophet said, this man is you. So you see, if the prophet would have gone to him first and said, well, you have done this unto Bathsheba and Uriah, you shall die. He would not have been so quick to defend which would have been the correct judgment, in this case. So, these parables, they're meant to present the story before you while removing you from it so that you don't give a biased answer. And these stories, they're entertaining. And the time he's telling these things, they're in complete captivation by him. So now we know that the ground is where you put your work in. This man's ground, it was a farm, right? It could have been flocks, animals, right? It could have been a tax collector, right? It could have been a soldier. Jesus himself was a carpenter. It could have been that. Simon Peter and them were fishermen. The ground is your platform. If you're a doctor, that's your ground. If you're a lawyer, that's your ground, right? A teacher, that's your ground. So it's your craft. It's the thing that you put your hands to, the thing that you've been studying for your whole life, right? How when you do certain things, you can go against the grain, and you can be you can have such ingenuity and come up with things that nobody else thought of. And then when you implement these things, you get such a great return. The greatest thinkers, right? The products that they have come up with and the advantage it gave them, and the customers, the business that they got from it, the sales, right? So he did the physical part, putting in the work. So now this ground, it brought forth plentiful. We know that a ground, it can be cursed. There, he just told the parable of many widows being in Israel in the days of Elias, when the heavens was shut up 3 years and 6 months. Great famine was throughout all the whole land. For 3 years and 6 months, nothing grew. So we know that the ground, it can be barren, right? It can be slow. Like, you could get a slow yield. You could get, pests, eating away at your crops as they are being formed. So everything worked out for this man, right? So then now he had a dilemma, saying how he doesn't know what he's gonna do. It brought forth so much he didn't have room to put it. Now that's a dilemma, right? Being blessed so much that you don't even know what to do with it. So now, what? A great opportunity for him, right? I would like people to think that, when this happens, that they're smart, right? That they look who they can help, right? You want to be generous with this, because I guarantee you, if he was generous with this, this would not happen. God, he would have seen his heart. He would have maybe even blessed him further. He would have made this a thing. He would have established him in having this kind of yield where he can, sustain others. So you see, he had, the wrong heart, the wrong mindset. So he doesn't know what to do. So we can see also him being unexpecting this kind of success. It went completely out of his head. He had no plan how to handle it. And I mean, it kind of also, I guess, shows humility. That, he wasn't really looking for much, and he would have been pleased with even just a little bit. So, there's also a humility aspect to it, right? But he was unprepared for this, kind of success. And, when God has, a great plan for your life, and you don't take the necessary precautions, right, to prepare yourself to be able to handle and operate in this thing, it can be such a disaster. What was meant to bless can mean, can become such a huge, stumbling block before you, as this did for this man. So preparation is right. In seeking riches, he should have been preparing himself. What if this, comes out so great? What, am I ready to handle this kind of thing? So he had a dilemma in himself. I don't know what to do. The space that I have. So now you could ask, well, did he make space also? Were the barns cluttered with other things? Did he have means to build more? Were things in the place of what was supposed to receive this, harvest? Was junk operated, taking up the space that this was supposed to be put in? God, when he is, promoting us to certain things, how he will, isolate us as he did Abraham. He took him from his family and then, empty everything out so that you have room to receive it. We just saw the parable of the new wine into new wine skins, right? Because the old ones will burst. Then we see him come up with a solution. This I shall do. I will pull down these barns and build greater. Then I shall bestow all my fruits and goods. So I want to start with the fruits and goods. So if you understand the fruits, right, that's the literal thing that it brought forth. Whether it be corn, apples, tomatoes, mangoes, pineapples, right? But goods now, I want to say that, maybe they mean the same thing and I'm just reading too much into it. But I would like to go out on a tangent and say the goods is what the fruit produces. What you use it to make. If it's oranges, maybe you make orange juice, right? And things like that. What you take the fruits, the literal, raw fruits, and you make, these goods, right? So he came up with a solution. I will tear down these barns and build bigger so that I can store it. So, he's thinking of, keeping all this to himself, store it. We hear no thought of him giving unto the poor. We hear no thought of him using this to solve problems. What problems is going on in the region? I think that's an important, thing. When God blesses you to have wealth, you can't just keep that to yourself. This is for the fixing, the the Revelation says the tree of life is for the healing of the nations, right? And I want to say the same thing when God blesses you with wealth. Your wealth is for the healing of the nations. I mean, you make a huge mistake if you take it and hold on to it. How many of these world's problems could be fixed just by the riches that some have? How many problems could they solve? And the world wouldn't be such a terrible place. But people, they're not thinking like that. They're thinking, well, I need this to last to the next 10 generations, right? Which is, fair, right? But, you have to understand the heart of God. Because, he's looking at the world all day. He's looking at poverty. He's looking at crime, murder, stealings, he's looking at, the evil hearts of men, just as he did with the flood. That's why he destroyed the earth by flood. He saw that the imagination of men's heart was evil continually. He said, even I sought for a man to stand in the gap before me to make up the hedge for the city that I destroyed not. But, I found none, so I had to destroy it. You standing in the gap with your wealth and fixing these world's problems. That's you standing in the gap, right? So I will tear down these barns and build bigger barns. So he has no intention of sharing this, right? He just wants to look at what he has and, marvel. Look at all these things that I have, right? I think in today's society, it would be that person who has that business and they're making so much money and they just watch their net worth go from the tens of millions to the hundreds of millions to the billions to the tens of billions to the hundreds of billions. We have no trillionaires, so far, right? So he decided to hold onto this and not spread it. So you see that this thing itself is a seed. His ground just brought forth, right? Why? Because he spread seeds and it brought forth such great. Now, what he's missing is that these things, they are also seeds, but not seeds to literally be planted in the ground, but to be planted in the world. Like I said, become a philanthropist. You find the problems that are there, and you put, just like how you were able to put your head together and get this harvest. Put your head together. What are the solutions? What can we come up with? How can we help those that can't help themselves? Right. So he didn't look at this as another form of seed, but he saw this as just a harvest to be eaten. So then we see him, having a moment of reflection to himself. He said, soul. He's saying unto his own soul, you have much goods laid up for many years, looking at, holding on to these things over a long period of time and having them sustain only himself. He's not looking to sustain anybody else. And I'll say it again, what I already said, how, God, he gives us these things, for us to do something with them. And I can't help but say, fix the problems of the world, right? What's going on? But he's not of that mindset. He's just, eat, drink, and be, he said, take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. So take thine ease. So now, if you're taking your ease, is he looking to help anyone? Is he looking to solve anything? No, he's more in a sitting back, just eating and drinking all day, enjoying these things. Have them, cheer him up daily. We don't see him going proactive to go out to conquer the world, conquer the world's problems with these things. But then, we see God, his reaction, how he said unto him, thou fool. People will say that, well, I worked hard and built this company. This is my money, right? And that's exactly what this man is saying, right? I don't see why I have to take this and use it for something I don't want to use it for. This is mine. I earned this. I put in all the late nights, early mornings. I had to sleep out of my car at first. I put everything I had into this. Friends left me, family left me, bosses left me, kids disowned me. I worked so hard. I know you're telling me that this doesn't belong to me. God called him thou fool, right? Thy soul shall be required of thee. So while he's telling his soul to drink and be merry, his soul is going to be required of him. That means he's going to die. Then who shall all these things be, right? So here we are, still in the early parts of the 12th chapter of Luke, where he started out saying, in the meantime, there was gathered together unto him an innumerable multitude, so much so that they trode one upon another. And he began to speak unto his disciples first of all, saying, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. For there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, nothing hid that shall not be made known. Whatsoever therefore you shall speak in the darkness shall be heard in the light. Whatsoever you have spoken in the ear in the closet shall be proclaimed on the rooftops. I say unto you, my friends, fear not them which kill the body and afterwards have nothing more that they can do. But I will forewarn you of whom you shall fear. Fear him that after having killed have power to cast into hell. I say unto you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings, yet not one of them is forgotten before God? Yet the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Worry not therefore, for ye are worth more value than many sparrows. Whosoever shall confess me before men, him shall the Son of Man confess before the angels of God. Whosoever shall deny me before men shall be denied before the angels of God. Whosoever shall speak a word against the Son of Man, it shall be forgiven him. But whosoever shall blaspheme the Holy Ghost, it shall not be forgiven him. And when they shall bring you before the synagogues, magistrates, and powers, take no thought how or what thing you shall answer or say. For the Holy Ghost in that same hour shall teach you what things you ought to say. And it came to pass, as he spake these things, a certain man of the company lifted up his voice and said, Master, speak unto my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus said unto him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? Then he said unto them, Take heed and beware of covetousness, because a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of things wherein he possesseth. So then we pick up right here where it says, And he spake a parable unto them. The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. So like I said, he just literally said, take heed and beware of covetousness. How, a man's life consisted not in the abundance of things wherein he possessed. So, we see how this man, he wants to sit, drink, and be merry, right? So his life now is the abundance of things wherein he possesses. So as they are much, he's going to be happy. He's building these bigger barns. So now he's looking at much. And when he sees these things, they are going to fill him with joy. So Jesus, he just told them a man's life consisted not of these things. And that's what this man is doing right now. So we see his ground bringing forth plentiful. So, he was diligent, right? Bible says that he that sleepeth in a harvest shall beg during the winter. When you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing at the right time, you're supposed to be doing it. Poverty shall come upon you, right? So this man, he was diligent, right? And it shows how riches can change a person, right? Because when he got all these things, look how he changed it. Look what he became. At first he was not, offensive before God, right? He didn't have enough to be offensive before God. And for some people, I would say that, God, he's doing you a favor by having you not be rich. God, he didn't have no problems with this guy before. When he was just humble, trying to get somewhere. But, as soon as he got there, then he changed. And now, look, he lost his life, right? So the ground, brought forth much. That means he had to plan, he had to do his research, right? What kind of crop he's going to grow, what kind of business, for the figurative example, what kind of services, what kind of career. You're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, a race car driver, a fireman, a fisherman, right? So he had to research it. If it required schooling, he had to, I guess, apply. He had to get the money to be able to pay for it. He had to study those, for those hard exams. Every time he felt like giving up, he had to push on. Every time he came close to failing, he had to somehow get through it, right? So, he was diligent in what he was supposed to do. And, no doubt God saw this diligence and he, rewarded him for it. So, you see how while a person is seeking, how different the heart is from when it has, accomplished and received what it is that it was seeking. The Bible says, seek me and you shall find me, right? When you seek for me with all your heart. Now, I would like to say this, you seek for God continually. I think it's so much, greater to seek, to find, because that's what this man, right? When he found how it changed him. But yesterday, while he was seeking, he was so diligent. He held his head down and he strove, right? Fought, no distractions, no foolishness, I'm trying to accomplish something. And you see that focus. God saw that. And that's how he ended up, with this blessing. So, you see how sometimes when we get what we want, how it can change our heart posture. For some people, I would say, God, he has a choice. Is he going to keep you for him humble? Or is he going to give you what you're asking for and have you be lost as this man is about to be? What would you do? If this was your child, would you give them the thing and have them be lost? Or would you keep them humble and save their soul? So the ground of this rich man, it brought forth plentifully. He did everything he needed to do. And, we see time, Ecclesiastes says time and chance, happen, to men, to the sons of men. Because, another man, he's going to plant. He's not going to get as much as this man got. So many things can happen. We can have a drought. We can have a famine. Some pests can be blown by the wind. When the Lord brought quail unto them in the wilderness, he said, I believe, was it the east wind that brought them from wherever they were, and they brought them all the way to them. Samson, he took the foxes and lit their tails, with firebrands, tail to tail, and set them in the standing corn of the Philistines, and he burned down their corn, right? Who knows what can happen, right? But, this man, he was lucky enough to survive all these things, and he made it, and he got his harvest. And like I said, he said, and he spake unto them by a parable. I already gave the example of David and the priest. How, this is meant to disarm. Because, all right, so this man, he just stood up and asked Jesus to divide the inheritance for him with his brother. So now, if he addresses him directly, he's going to be now upset. He's going to be offended. And the worst thing he can do is speak directly to an angry person. So, he's using symbolism right now. So this is going to disarm that guy. And he's going to look at it and see it. And, if Jesus has his way, then, he's going to even be willing to consider that, well, maybe this riches is not, automatically the best thing for me. Maybe it can come and, be a hindrance to me. Maybe I will be better off without this thing. Maybe he can even open up that kind of reasoning. All right, so the next verse says, and he said within himself, what shall I do? For I have no room for to bestow my fruits. So, completely surprised. You will ask the question, well, the people in that region that have attempted what he's doing before him, did they not bring forth this kind of return on their planting in their ground, right? Was this an isolated event? Was he blessed beyond measure above anybody else that was in his region? Was this a regular thing? And if it was a regular thing, then he did not do his homework, right? Because then he would have known what to expect and that he was, under prepared to host, all these crops, these fruits as he calls them. So he said within himself. So he didn't say this out loud. No doubt this man, he's the master. And, he did not consult with his his workers that were most likely watering these crops, that were monitoring them, see that they were growing okay and no pests was messing with it. Nobody was coming through messing with it, that there was nothing that needed to be addressed. So he said within himself, right? So the joy that he's having is overwhelming right now, and he's excited. And we see him saying within himself, he didn't say unto God, thank you. We don't see a thank you unto God, right? We don't see asking for direction from God. The child of God, you don't leave God out of anything. I would have liked to have seen, okay, God, you have blessed me with all these things. How can I, do what you would have me do? Yeah, I know that I will keep some for myself, but what can I do? We would have liked to have seen, involving of God in this, but he spoke to himself, right? So the Bible literally says that some men, their God is their own belly. And that's literally what this man is doing, because he's gonna eat and drink all of this. So he's talking to himself. He is his own God, right? And it also shows how, when you get, enough power and authority, how you can get the big head, right? You lose humility. He had enough, resources right now. He felt powerful and he didn't need nobody, we don't see him speaking unto God right now. So how he said, within himself, what shall I do? You want to know what to do. Are you a praying man? Did you ask God? All right, so here's the opportunity. He's asking a question, but he's asking himself, what shall I do? I guarantee you, God, he can give you a better answer than you can give yourself. And it also shows how, diligence, brings us unto God, even if we don't have a relationship with him, right? Because this man is showing that he did not have a relationship with God. Or maybe he did and he was slacking. But how diligence brought him into fellowship with God. Just being diligent and hardworking and humble and honest, because he was honest at first. And even though he didn't have a working relationship with God, this brought him into a sort of union with God, right? But see, because there was no relationship, when this thing that was gone, then he completely fell flat. So what shall I do? For I have no room to bestow my goods. Pretty sure he had enough. He said for years. Are these gonna last? For years. We know that Joseph in Egypt, the famine was 7 years. God had him with corn. I believe, was it corn he had, right? So they ate corn for 7 years. And that's hard to spoil. I would love to have heard what kind of crop this was. Was it like mangoes that spoil so easy, or strawberries, right? Some they spoil so easy. What kind of crop is this? Is it gonna last these years that he's hoping for it to last? For I have nowhere to bestow these things. I didn't think this far ahead. I did not anticipate this kind of blessing. So we see him mentally unprepared. And sometimes that just goes to show you, when you're unprepared, the outcome is anybody's guess. It can be good, it can be bad. But how being unprepared, can cost you. Because if he had a plan, maybe he would have done something better with it. So the next verse says, then he said within himself, this I shall do. I shall pull down my barns and build bigger barns, and there shall I bestow all my fruits and goods. So he's talking to himself, right? I said, an answer from God will be better than any answer you can give yourself. And things, they are meant for a reason, right? Famine in Egypt was coming. What if Pharaoh, when he heard this, he didn't decide to supply the land, right? What if he was selfish? This 7 years of plentiful, for it was 7 years plentiful, then 7 years famine. What if during the 7 years of plentiful, he did not, consult God? What if he wasted it? What if, he did, anything except what Joseph made him do, which is to store up it was 25, was it 1/5, right? 20%. Each year they stored 20%, and I guess they ate or sold 80. What if during these 7 years, you see, this had a purpose? What if all these, return that he got, what if it had a purpose? Just like with Joseph. Now we know that there was no famine. It was not said that there was a famine, right? Or if there was, it was not mentioned. What if this had a purpose? What if, many people were praying prayers and this was the answer to these prayers? Can you see how angry, this would make God? If you look at it from that, if all these people are praying unto him, and then here's the answer, and this man is going to go and do this. He lost his life, right? That's the kind of anger from God that it'll cut you off right off this earth. Looking at Egypt, right? 7 years of famine. What if Pharaoh didn't do right by the people? I mean, nobody would be left. They would have all died. I guess they would have at some point maybe started eating each other. And the last person to be, eaten, he would have been the only survivor. So they will have bestowed my fruits and goods. And like I said, fruits are the literal thing that it produces. But the goods now, right, is when you convert this into something else. All right, so the next verse says, and he said unto his own soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. So he's talking to his own soul. Now, a person talking to a soul. Who speaks to souls, right? It's God that speaks to soul. I said he's being his own God, right? He's speaking to his own soul, right? Thou has much good laid up for many years. So I'm guessing that they can last many years and not, spoil. So now he's about to, build big storehouses just to hold these things. So he's planning on keeping this to himself. And we see him, ready to go into a state of stupor, right? The diligence, like I said, that he showed before God, for God to bless him like this. Now it's completely gone. Because you see, there's no relationship with God. I said he's his own God. Now he's talking to his own soul, right? Soul, thou has many goods. Like I said, you should have been praying unto God at least, right? So there's something for you to understand, involve God in everything, right? And like I said, what if this had a purpose? And look what he's wanting to do. Eat and drink and be merry while all these prayers go unanswered. And now God's name is attached to all these things, right? Was it Esther when Jews were being persecuted and Mordecai, her uncle, came in and said, we are all going to perish because the decree is given and they're going to start hunting us down and killing us. But you think that because you're the queen, no, you're going to be safe. If you don't arise and deliver your people, deliverance is going to come from somewhere else. And who knows where that's going to leave you. Who knows if you were put here for this purpose. So who knows if this is for this, is for a purpose. And now look at what he's going to do. So now the people, they don't get their deliverance. I said, riches and wealth and that kind of influence is meant to solve the world's problems. It's not for you to look at your money as this man wants to do and smile when it's high and then get sad when it's low. So that's literally what's going to happen to him. He's going to smile when it's high. When it starts running low, he's going to get sad. Some men trust in horses. Some men trust in chariots. Some men trust in their riches. We shall remember the name of our God. I was saying earlier how, who you are should not be, motivated by what you have. Your principles, your morals, your ethics, the things you believe and hold true, your values, your character, right? Material things should not mold these things because that is such a shaky ground. He just spoke of them of, building the house upon the rock and not on the sand. You building these things on material things is building that house on the sand, literally. Then when you lose them, then now you have nothing to stand on. And now you become weak and insecure and, you fall away. The strength that you had is gone. The confidence you had is gone. The position you had is gone. It's like you are completely derailed. And he said unto his soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years, not even checking to see what the purpose of these things are. Take thine ease, right? Eat, drink, and be merry. So he's talking to him own self as if somebody else is talking to him. He's giving his own self advice. Just take it easy. Just eat, drink, and be merry. We see a lack of purpose. He only planned this far, and he didn't even plan to make it this far, right? So that shows it's good to, it's not that it's good, but you need, it's an absolute need to always have goals. I really do think that, I like to use the, athletes the most because I think that they are most susceptible to this because they are literally performance based. Athletes that fall, they achieve their goals, right? And then they run out of goals. They don't make new goals. You always have to be pursuing something. You can even pursue the same goals. Yeah, I've accomplished them, but my goal is to still pursue these things. Did you know that you can still pursue goals that you've already accomplished? I want to win a championship. We want it. Okay, I want to win championships. And then that's your goal, right? I want to shoot a certain shot percentage. I want to make a certain amount of points per year. Goals, right? Because otherwise you're just floating around. As this man, take thine ease. What is he taking thine ease? He's sitting in a chair, eating and drinking every day, losing all the diligence that got him here. So then now we see a separation of him from God. He lost the diligence, there was no relationship, but the diligence brought him close to God. And now that is gone, now he is separated from God. So the last verse says, but God, said unto him, thou fool, this night thy very soul shall be required of thee. Then whose things shall all these things be which thou hast provided? So he's calling him a fool. He was not a fool when he was building, though, right? God is calling. So now, so he has transitioned from being wise to be a fool. Just because of how much he, got. He didn't have a plan past the harvest. So he didn't have anything to pursue and be diligent towards. So now he became a fool. The same man, I guarantee you, probably believed the same thing. Was the same everything. It's just that he had a goal and he went after it with such diligence, right? So thou fool, your thinking is so wrong. Like I said, what if this was to, fix all these prayers that were being prayed? Just want to sit there and be a drunkard. What are you not pursuing anything? Yeah. All right. So now you have the resources. You fought hard and you got the resources. Resources to do what? What is your mission? So we see the absence of a mission. When you fill your, gas tank with gas, now you have the fuel. Fuel for what? Where are we going? So now you see this harvest, it was the fuel for his mission. But he decided that his mission is going to be to sit at home and drink and be merry. And that is no mission. Who is that helping? That's not even helping himself. Because then you get lazy and you become a sluggard, right? Probably get big and fat and get unhealthy. Then whose things shall all these things be? This is such a statement, right? Because it shows that nothing is really ours. We're just stored, as God says. We're just stewards over these things. All things are his. And he's showing this directly unto you that if I remove you, then this goes to somebody else. And who knows if this person is going to be wise or foolish? You don't even, it's showing that you don't even know what's going to happen to it when you're gone. I'm Straw Greenhorn.